This is Paul Schmid. Welcome to the Pursuit Zone. In the summer of 2016, a team of 4 from Oxford University traveled into the Arctic Circle to ski east to west across the island of Spitsbergen, part of a Norwegian archipelago. They retraced a 1923 expedition that contributed a great deal of scientific knowledge about the region. Their goal was to conduct new research to tell the story of how the landscape has changed over nearly a century. For 32 days and 180 miles, they hauled their sleds across the landscape, looking to repeat the photos from 1923 and filming a documentary. Pursuing mountaineering objectives was another part of the Spitsbergen retraced expedition, led by James Lam. And you can learn more at Svalbard2016.com. James Lam, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Thank you very much for having me.
James, how did you get connected to this project?
So it all sort of kicked off back in November last year. A group of us went to hear a talk in Oxford about these series of expeditions in the 1920s. They were basically the first to visit this region of the Arctic, then known as Spitsbergen. We sort of realized that no one had actually been back since. So it sort of immediately dawned on me that it would be an amazing expedition to go back and retrace one of these expeditions. Yeah, this 1923 expedition particularly stood out because a group of 4 of them were the first to retrace this island. They essentially they mapped the region for the first time. The more we read, the more we researched about the expedition, the more it sort of came to life. So there turned out to be quite a lot of stuff in the archives in Oxford and around the UK. And we discovered a whole series of these landscape photos that they'd taken, as well as diaries from 3 of the members of their team. And sort of reading through their diaries and looking at the photos, we sort of decided to go back this summer and sort of follow in their footsteps.
What was special about the 1923 expedition?
They were the first to cross the island of Spitsbergen, and all they did along the way was they essentially didn't really know where they were going. So they knew the starting point and the ending point, but no one had been inland from there. So they took these sledges, which weighed about 500 pounds each, and crossed the island. So they took photos and mapped the entire region. So when we went back, we actually had their maps that they created, which in parts it was amazing how accurate they are. And then because they didn't really have the bigger picture, the whole thing was a bit distorted. But yeah, it was essentially quite a groundbreaking expedition.
Well, I had read that they used state-of-the-art photography technology of the time and also wireless technology. What does that mean?
Yeah, they had a number of cameras, and at the time, even sort of the best quality cameras were still these sort of huge things that weren't particularly portable, but they were able to carry them and take them up these mountains. And what they did was they took these photos, and then from the photos, they then produced the maps, which was fairly cutting edge at the time. And the wireless technology was essentially they were trying to be able to communicate between them and the ship that had dropped them off. So it turned out to actually be quite temperamental and didn't work particularly well in the end. But the idea was that they were supposed to be able to communicate with the boat that was then going to pick them up 30 days later. But yeah, essentially it was a very primitive radio.
What should we know about any of those 1923 expedition team members?
So yeah, they were a team from Oxford, and probably the most famous member was Andrew Irvine, who was immortalised a year later when he died on Everest, trying to make the first ascent with George Mallory. And it was really Svalbard that prepared him for that expedition on Everest. So he was only 21 when he went to Svalbard. And another member of the team, Noel Odell, was sort of his mentor and was also sort of an experienced Himalayan climber who then recommended that he should go to Everest the next year. And Noel was actually the last person to see both Sandy and George Mallory alive as they disappeared into the cloud in 1924.
I thought I read that one of the team members lived until age 97. Was that right?
Yeah, I think that might have been Noel O'Dell actually. So I think he died reasonably recently, it's the last couple of decades. And there's certainly video footage of him doing various interviews. Sadly, none of them are still around today. Although we have been in contact with, so Sandy Irvin's niece wrote his biography, and she's been extremely helpful in sort of giving us more details. And we've been in touch with a number of the family members of the original expedition, which has been really fascinating.
What advantages does your team have over this 1923 team?
So, of course, we were using all the sort of the cutting edge modern equipment, which was inevitably a bit lighter than theirs. So our sledges were just under 100 kilos each. We had one each, which made it slightly easier to go over the rough terrain, whereas they just had two between the four of them. So there are times where they had to sort of relay these huge sledges where all four of them would go back to pull just one sledge at a time because the ground was so difficult to cross. But when it came to it, actually, I think the biggest advantage we had over the 1923 team was the weather that we experienced. So from reading their diaries, we could see sort of the different conditions they had in different parts of the route. And there was one particular section where they were crossing what was known as the Loven Plateau, which took them about 5 days and nights to cross because the snow was essentially so soft that they were unable to make really any or particularly efficient progress. And we were really lucky that we got a cold spell at the same time. So we crossed the same distance in about 12 hours that they'd taken, as if almost 5 days to cross.
James, tell me about the other team members that you had along.
There were actually 5 of us in the end. So there was Jamie Gardner, who was the team historian, and he was also directing the film and the filming that we were doing out there. So we were hoping to produce a film or TV program off the back of the expedition. There's Will Hart, who is the expedition medic, and he was actually the only person with Nordic skiing experience before we started. So that was extremely useful. Liam Garrison, who is the photographer and filmmaker. So he was there with the camera and sort of trying to capture as much of our expedition as possible. And he was also responsible for retaking the photos that they had taken in 1923. We were also joined by a Norwegian, Endre Fjord Jermensen, who was sort of our local guide, and he's involved in a lot of research around Svalbard. So he's a glaciologist and geologist, and he was collaborating on some of the research that we were doing. There was also our home agent, Giles Colclough, who was based in Oxford. He was sort of the main point of contact for our expedition. So we were getting weather forecasts from him every day, and he was sort of our contact with the outside world.
How difficult was that to retake those exact photos from 1923?
After a while, you get your eye in. But yeah, essentially, it is very difficult. So you have, we had a series of photos, and some of them had vague descriptions of where they were. Some of them had nothing at all and were just a photo, and some of them were actually mislabeled. So they said they were on a certain mountain when it turned out the labels had been mixed up, and they're actually from completely different parts of the island. And we were quite lucky to sort of get to the summit of a mountain where they'd taken the photo from, and it was quite clear which direction it was in, and the weather was sort of similar for both of us. And those ones were reasonably easy, but then there were others with sort of fewer distinguishing features that ended up taking a lot longer to retake. And of course, just finding the locations they'd taken their photos from was actually very difficult in some cases. But yeah, we were lucky enough to be able to retake about 25 of their original photos. Some of them don't really show much change at all, but some of them, there's quite a drastic change between what they experienced and what the conditions are like today.
9 months of planning and training. What did you find to be the toughest part of the planning?
Well, 9 months obviously sounds like a long time to plan an expedition, but when it got down to it, there was actually so much to do during that time because we were all studying as well. Just fitting everything in and making sure everything was prepared, because obviously you can't let anything just sneak up on you when you get there. The biggest obstacle was fundraising. So we had to raise about £50,000 in the end, and that came from sort of grants, sponsorship, and we launched a crowdfunding campaign as well. And that took just a huge amount of time to liaise with all the sponsors and the donors. But in the end, we were successful. And I guess the sort of the skills training and the physical training was very taxing. None of us had really had any experience of polar environments before. So we spent a lot of time making sure we knew the equipment inside out so we could use it in sort of the challenging environments that we experienced. But then also we had a training expedition to Norway around Easter, which I think was really critical in sort of developing our skills that we need when we're out there.
£50,000, that's a lot of money. Did you get started right away on the fundraising?
Yeah, so when we came up with the idea, one of the first things I did was sort of go through and try and make an approximate budget for what the whole thing would cost. And so when it came out as that much, I was quite shocked. And that was certainly one of the biggest hurdles. But just because it's such a remote place, everything costs quite a lot just to sort of just to reach the start of the just to reach our starting place. We have to charter a boat, and then all the equipment, of course, is certainly not cheap. So yeah, it all adds up. Yeah, we were lucky enough to be sponsored by a number of very generous companies. Very lucky to be able to raise that amount in the end.
What percentage of that did you get from your crowdfunding?
About 25%, I guess. In Oxford, one of our colleges was very kind to support us with that, so we were able to use some of their contacts to help us. But getting in touch with all the donors was a lot of work. It's certainly not an easy way to fund an expedition.
Tell me a little bit about how you get to the starting point. I want to hear more about the boats that you were on.
The starting point was the northeast corner of the island of Spitsbergen. We started in a place known as the Hinlopen Strait, which is between two of the islands. And we were on a boat called Targa 42, which is a 42-foot motorboat with cabins and beds and stuff. We were expecting it to take sort of between 12 and 14 hours is what we'd been told. But we were quite unlucky, actually, and we got caught up in a big storm on the way out. The waves were absolutely huge, sort of breaking over the front of the boat. And a few of us got quite seasick, but we managed to persuade the captain, thankfully, was happy to push on. And we finally sort of made it to the starting point after about 20 hours. Apparently on the way back, the captain had said that actually the conditions got even worse. He'd been up for about 36 hours by the time he got back to the capital. So we owe him a huge debt that he went to all that trouble to drop us at the starting point.
So just so that I understand, were you on this boat all the way from England?
No. So on Svalbard, there's a capital called Longyearbyen, which is sustained by research. There's a university base out there and tourism. So we were able to get a flight from London to Longyearbyen via Oslo, which was surprisingly easy. And then from there, most of the people who visit sort of stay in that vicinity. So there are a reasonable number of tourists around there. But then in order to get to the starting point of our route was then the difficult bit. So there's no regular boats that go around there. So we were then forced to charter our own boat to get to this remote part of the island.
When you're out there, how do you describe the landscape?
So it was actually extremely varied. The beginning was completely snow-free. So Svalbard itself is actually about 60% ice cap, and then the rest is sort of barren rock, and then there's about 10% of vegetated land. So we got dropped off on the edge of a glacier, so we were starting on ice. So at the beginning we were making progress just by just using crampons and just to gain a bit of altitude. And then we crossed these ice plateaus that basically have no real distinguishing feature. So they're basically completely white snow for as far as you can see. The central part of our journey was in a mountain range called the Assenfjellet Mountains, and they are really quite incredible. They're sort of these alpine peaks that are jagged and quite imposing. So yeah, there was a huge range of landscape in what was actually quite a small area, but that's sort of part of what makes Svalbard such an amazing place.
How closely were you retracing the footsteps from the 1923 expedition?
So their core route, which was from their starting point to the end point, we retraced almost exactly because we had the diaries and the maps, we could see where they'd been. But then they made a number of excursions to summit various mountains, and they made a few sidetracks purely because they didn't know exactly where they were going. So we followed the main route, but then we followed a number of their sidetracks and summited all the same mountains that they summited. But there were a few that we didn't quite follow, and then we made a number of other sort of excursions to do some of our research that they hadn't taken. But essentially, we were following them very closely.
Did you get an opportunity to do any ascents of some new peaks?
So although this area isn't visited particularly often, all the mountains have been climbed as far as we're aware. What we did do is we repeated one of the routes on a mountain called Mount Irvine, which was named after Sandy Irvine. They first climbed in 1923. We were the second ascensionists, so no one's climbed it since they climbed it 93 years ago, which is quite amazing. It's this sort of striking ridge that comes down from the summit of Mount Irvine, and it's got this amazing rock. And obviously the climb was made even more special by the fact that we knew that they'd been there almost a century ago.
What did you find to be the most challenging part of mountaineering in Spitsbergen? So
of course it's extremely remote, so you don't really want to be falling off or making many mistakes. But on the whole, in the Atomfjella range, the rock was actually quite solid. We did another climb on Mount Newton, or Newtontoppen, which is the highest mountain on Svalbard. We actually climbed a new route up that along the East Ridge. The rock there is absolutely incredible. So it's as good as anything you'd find in the Alps in Europe. Everything's super solid, but there are other mountains that we climbed that were really loose, and none of the rock was particularly solid. So you had to be careful with sort of every hand and foothold, because there was always the risk that the rock would just come off your hand.
One of the images on your website, it shows a pair of skis that has some images that have been printed onto the skis. Can you tell me a little bit more about the skis that you were on?
So we were on these skis made by Osnes called the Nansens, which are named after a famous Norwegian explorer he was the first person to cross the interior of Greenland. And he was almost he came close to being the first person to reach the North Pole in an expedition that lasted almost 3 years. So he's sort of a bit of a polar hero. But the skis themselves were sort of like Nordic touring skis, but slightly wider and had a bit more of a side cut, which meant that they were quite efficient for going along flat. But you had a bit more control for sort of the downhill sections, whereas like a more standard cross-country ski or Nordic ski would be slightly thinner. It wouldn't have the same side cut, so that means it's slightly faster on the flats, but it means going downhill is pretty scary. So we had a sort of a balance between the two.
How was the snow that you skied through?
So it was actually extremely variable. There were times when the snow was sort of really solid and you can make quite good progress, and then we had a few days where the weather really warmed up and the snow was really sort of slushy, which meant both the skis and the sledges had a lot more friction, which makes everything a lot tougher. When it got really cold on the downhill sections, everything just completely iced over, which is, again, very unpleasant. It made the skiing quite hard. So, yeah, there wasn't a huge amount of fresh snow out there. But for the majority of the time, actually, we were quite lucky with the snow conditions. They were sort of nothing too challenging.
What were the range of temperatures that you saw between the morning and the evening?
Well, because Svalbard is so far north, there's actually sunlight 24 hours a day. It never gets dark during the summer. So although there was a dip in temperature at night, it wasn't that huge. But so the maximum temperatures we had were about 5 degrees Celsius. And then it got down, there were a few periods where it got down to sort of minus 15, minus 22 Celsius, which I guess is about 0 Fahrenheit. And when the wind really picks up, then it does get very cold up there, actually. We did get caught in a couple of big storms. So the biggest one, we've essentially got to this glacier underneath a bit of rock called the Citadel, which is this amazing sort of 300-foot face. And we started digging in our camp. And then the wind sort of kept on picking up. So we had to sort of keep on digging down to try and protect our tents. And after about 5 hours of digging, because we were digging sort of into the glacier, we eventually tried to put up our tents, and it was even after digging sort of 6 feet down, we still weren't able to put up our tent because it was just so windy. So we were forced to get in our survival shelter and spend about 9 hours waiting for the wind to die down. So we think the winds was somewhere around just below 60 miles an hour, which, when you're completely exposed on a glacier is quite hard to deal with.
What is a survival shelter, and how does that differ from a tent?
So essentially, a survival shelter is just a big piece of waterproof fabric, I guess a bit like a parachute. So what you do is basically you put it around everyone in the group and then get the edges underneath you and sit on it. So it doesn't have any poles or any support really. So it's just supported by the people inside it, and it means you can't get damaged basically. It actually stays reasonably warm because you're in such a sort of enclosed environment. It can really make the difference between getting really quite cold and just being able to get out of the elements and protect yourself.
So how cramped are you guys when you're in there?
Technically, it's like a 10-person shelter, but that's if there were 10 people in there would be literally no room to move at all. So that'd be sort of shoulder to shoulder. So we had a little bit of room to play around with, but enough for maybe 2 people to lie down at a time, and then the rest would sort of be supporting the shelter. So during that period, we weren't really able to rest at all. And when we got in the shelter, we didn't really know how long we'd have to be in there for. Our forecast hadn't really predicted this much wind. So we sort of hunkered down and we were waiting what could have been indefinitely for the wind to die down. But eventually, as I say, about 9 hours later, it did finally die down. We were able to put up the tent, start cooking some food and things.
What are some of the dangers that you face out there?
One of the things we were really worried about, particularly during the storm, was basically if one of our tents broke, then because we only had 2 tents between us, we didn't really have any backups. If our tent had broken, that would have pretty much been game over for the expedition, which is why we were being so cautious then. So obviously, weather is one of the main dangers. And then what's interesting about Svalbard is that it has a huge population of polar bears. It has about 3,000 polar bears sort of in that region. So although they sound quite cute and fluffy, they are actually one of the biggest land predators. And they're one of the only animals in the world that actually hunts humans. So obviously they were quite one of our biggest concerns in terms of risks that we can really control. So we put a lot of planning into mitigating those risks. So we actually had a dog with us that was essentially this big sort of wolf-like dog that was there to warn us of any polar bears coming in the vicinity. And then we had flares to sort of scare off the polar bears should they come close. And in the higher risk areas, which are mainly around the coast, we had a 24-hour watch system. So that meant that while the other 4 slept, there would always be one person awake in case there was a polar bear that came a bit too close for comfort. And we'd be able to get everyone out of their tents and ready to scare it off. And then sort of the final line of defense was a gun. So we had a couple of guns just in case that nothing else worked and we had to kill a polar bear. But that, as I say, is very much the last line of defense. And if you're able to use the flares effectively, then in theory you shouldn't really need to kill like 98% of the polar bears. You should be able to scare off, but there was always the risk that there's one that really has it in for you.
Did you see any polar bears?
No. So after all the preparation, we didn't see a single one, which I guess in a way is a bit annoying, but because there was such a big risk, it's sort of relief that we didn't have to deal with them. At the end of our trip, there had been reports that there was actually a whole family on the same glacier that we were on, but we happened to be on the other side of it, so we didn't actually bump into, we didn't see a single one after all that.
What other wildlife did you see out there?
So around the coast, there's a reasonable amount of wildlife. There are actually a huge number of seabirds that make their homes in Svalbard, most of which migrate down in the colder months. And there are some that actually migrate all the way from Svalbard down to Antarctica. We were able to see a few of those sort of at the start and the end of our route. But actually, in the central sections, sort of at a bit higher altitude, there really is no wildlife. So we went for weeks without seeing anything else. It was a bit strange. But there's no
Is Svalbard, that's hard to pronounce. Is that the name of the archipelago? And then Spitsbergen is one of the islands among that archipelago? Is that how
Yeah,
it?
exactly. So Svalbard is the whole archipelago. That's the Norwegian territory, and then Spitsbergen is the name of the biggest island. But it's also the name Svalbard came later. So actually, in 1923, when the original expedition went there, they wouldn't have recognised the name Svalbard. It was actually known as East Spitsbergen then. The two are sort of interchangeable.
You also went there to do some scientific research. Part of that involved using drones, which I thought was pretty interesting. What can you tell me about the research that you were doing?
So there are basically a few aspects of the research. So one of the strands of the research was basically using drones to map these glaciers. The idea was that in 1923 they had gone out with the best technology available, which was just a camera on a tripod, and they were able to map the landscape. So we were hoping to go back to use the cutting edge technology that's available now to map the landscape in a far higher detail. Essentially, we got this consumer drone, which is a DJI Phantom 4. And with a special piece of software, we got it to fly sort of along the glaciers, taking sort of a series of photos, which you can then take and put it into a piece of software that then sort of analyzes the points within the photos and creates this 3D model, which is extremely high resolution. Yeah, I'm working on that at the moment to hopefully produce a publication off the back of that. We're hopefully going to be able to create these really high resolution maps of some of the glaciers, which hasn't been done before. And then the other strand of the research was like a sort of biological based. On the rocky outcrops along the route, there were a series of plants, and we essentially went up and sampled plants along our route and at different altitudes. And we're working in collaboration with the University in Norway to basically take DNA samples from these plants and map how they're dispersed along these glaciers.
I want to circle back around because I forgot to ask about the dog. How did this dog become part of the expedition?
Well, depending on who you ask, there are lots of different sort of best protocols for dealing with polar bears. And some people use these tripwire systems. So essentially you have these posts around your camp with tripwires on. So if a polar bear walks through, then it's supposed to go off and sort of warn you and hopefully scare away the polar bear. But we'd heard that essentially there have been a number of stories where they haven't been as reliable as they're supposed to be. So another option was taking a dog, which is generally considered to be the most reliable option because polar bear's never going to sort of get anywhere near a dog without waking it up and causing a bit of a racket. So we managed to get this dog, which used to be sort of like a dog sledding dog and has quite a good record with polar bears. So apparently he had been in the field quite a lot, and people sort of knew that if you were to encounter polar bears, then he'd definitely warn you when they were getting close. And he was like an amazing companion on the trip. And, I think everyone was really glad that we brought him along in the end.
What was your favorite part of the expedition?
Probably some of the mountaineering was my favorite. It was sort of being such a remote landscape and climbing these mountains, which very few people have ever climbed, and being able to put up new routes there was a really special experience. So I'd probably say that the mountaineering was my favorite part.
What was your biggest takeaway?
There were some things we overprepared for, but I think that we spent a lot of time sort of training and putting in the groundwork before the expedition, and I think that really paid off in the end. I've been saying to people that I've been amazed that nothing really went wrong and it all seemed to go to plan. I think that was mainly because of the amount of time we put in before we left in preparing for the expedition. So yeah, even though it may seem that we prepared too much, I don't think that's really possible. I think, the hours that we put in beforehand really paid off.
So you said there were some things that you may have over-prepared for. What, like, give me an example.
So say the polar bears, for example, we spent sort of tens of hours thinking up the best strategy for what happens if we see a polar bear or how to best protect ourselves. And although we didn't encounter a polar bear in the end, I think that time was definitely not wasted. The hours we put in definitely were worth it.
So your expedition is a little bit different from the one 93 years ago because nowadays with all this modern technology and blogs and video and so on, let's say 93 years from now, some more Oxford University students are researching you, what would you say to them? What would you want to say to them?
Hopefully there would still be similarities, and I'd say they should be as ambitious as possible. And while we had our objectives, they don't necessarily need to follow us exactly. So we took the expedition from 1923 and sort of put our own spin on it. So I'd say that if someone does happen to repeat our expedition, I would say that they should put their own spin on it as well, and try and use whatever cutting edge technology is available then to sort of progress the scientific research in that area.
What's happening with the movie part of the project?
We're quite excited about that at the moment. So we're in contact with a director in London who's sort of really behind the project and is really enthusiastic about pushing this forwards. So we're cutting together a trailer at the moment, which we're hopefully going to then sort of pitch to broadcasters. So hopefully the ideal scenario would be for someone like the BBC or Nat Geo to sort of see it and like the idea and hopefully make a sort of full TV program out of it, or even a series. And failing that, we would probably make our own movie, just sort of for film festivals. But yeah, we're quite excited about how that's progressing at the moment. So it's definitely space to be watched.
Do you have any type of a time frame in mind of when this could happen?
So we're going to be speaking to broadcasters in the next few months, and then if they decide to pick it up, and I think they tend to work a bit slower, so it could be almost a year or two before a final product gets released. But if we were to make our own film, then I guess towards the end of next year or maybe middle of next year, we'd hope to release it.
James, what's next for you?
So I've just graduated, so I'm currently looking for a job. But I'm always thinking about my next expedition. I think that Svalbard or somewhere in the Arctic is definitely on the cards for my next big expedition.
What kind of a job are you trying to get?
I'm not really sure at the moment. I'm looking at something potentially to do with energy. I'm very interested in progressing sustainable energy, and I think should be a really worthwhile thing to sort of commit my career towards. So yeah, just seeing what's available at the moment.
How can people contact you if they want to learn more about this expedition?
So I think probably the best place is our Facebook page. So if you just search Spitsbergen Retraced, we should be up there. Or have a look on our website, svalbard2016.com.
James Lam, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much.
Recorded October 10th, 2016. For more great podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.